Taxes, our brackets, our deductions, how much are you actually paying? Let's talk about it. Hello everybody, Joe Werbert coming at you, and today we are going to talk about taxes. Now, I know this isn't a fun topic, and this isn't something you probably spend a lot of time thinking about, but you should, because a large portion of your paycheck goes towards this, and I need everybody out there to understand the basics behind income taxes in the United States. Now, we've had this tax system around for the past 100 years, and it has changed dramatically over that time period. We operate on a progressive tax system. Simply means that the more income you make, the higher your tax can be. But it's not that simple, and there's a lot more that goes into it. So what are tax brackets? Well, as you can see in this picture here, these are our current tax brackets. And as you earn more income, you pay a slightly higher or a significantly higher tax on that income. For our discussion today, I'm going to use the married tax bracket. Now we have single filers, we have married filing separately, we have widow. There's a lot of different tax brackets, and just because I don't want this to become too confusing, we're going to go off of married couples for our discussions today. And when we talk about tax brackets, as you can see here, these are our tax brackets for the year 2020. And in America, $0 to $19,750 puts you in the 10% tax bracket. The next dollar above $19,750, now you jump to the 12% tax bracket. The 12% tax bracket goes from $19,751 all the way up to $80,250. That's how a progressive tax works. The first bracket is taxed at that, say, 10% amount. The next bracket is taxed at the 12% amount. But over the years, these brackets have changed, and the number of brackets have changed. Today, we have 7 tax brackets. Back in the 40s, we had 24 tax brackets. There were times when we had 25 tax brackets, and every few $1,000s that you earned puts you into a higher tax bracket. All of this craziness of 20 plus tax brackets changed when Ronald Reagan came into power in the 80s, and he adopted what's known as the 7 tax bracket system. And then in 2017, with the Tax Cuts and Jobs Act, we saw taxes fall even lower. And as I've said in other videos, today we're at the lowest tax brackets we've seen in this country going back 100 years. But when I've dug into the brackets, I was shocked to find numbers that I did not expect to find. So what confuses me about tax brackets is the rhyme or the reason, the math behind the increase. Because we start with a 10% tax bracket, and then we move from 10 to 12, which is a 20% increase in tax brackets. But then the next tax bracket is the 22% tax bracket, but that's an 83.3% tax increase. So we want 20% to 83%. And then the next bracket goes from 22 to 24, and that's only a 9% increase. And then we go from 24 to 32, and that's a 33%. So we've had 20, and then 83, and then 9, and now a 33% tax increase. And then to go from 32 to 35 is a 9.3% increase. And then our final bracket from 35 to 37 is only a 5% increase. So there doesn't seem to be any reason behind the math of the tax bracket increases. And all the research I've found nothing to explain these increases to me. But that's not the true picture, because while the tax brackets tell you a little bit about your increase in taxes paid, that's not really what you pay in taxes, because everybody gets a standard deduction. And a standard deduction is how much you get to just completely take off your taxes. So if you're a married couple in 2020, the first $24,800 you earn is not taxable. That is your standard deduction. You get to wipe that off your income. So if you're a married couple and you just made $24,800 and that's all you made, that would be wiped off your taxes, and your taxable income for that year would be $0. Now for a single person, that's $12,400. So when you apply the math along with the standard deduction, you start to see that these increases are not what they appear. So as I said, the first tax bracket's 10%. And to go from the first tax bracket to the second tax bracket, we have a 20% increase. 10 to 12 is a 20% increase. But the effective tax rate increase is not 20%. The effective tax rate increase is actually 80%. How did I get that? Well, let's look at the brackets. In order to pay a 10% tax, your income would have to be below $19,750. As I said before, anything above $19,750 moves you from the 10% bracket to the 12% bracket. So if you're a married couple and you earn $43,000, the first thing you do is take the standard deduction. $43,000 minus $24,500 gets you not in the 12% tax bracket, but back down to the 10% tax bracket. So on that $43,000 of earnings, your taxable income would be around $19,000. That $19,000 would be taxed at 10%, and your total income tax would be $1,900. So while an individual who earns $44,000 is in the top of the 10% tax bracket, because the standard deduction takes them back down to $19,000, they're only paying an actual tax of around 5% tax on their $44,000 of earnings. But an individual who's at the top of the 12% tax bracket and is paying roughly $9,000 of income tax, they're paying around 9% tax on their income, which at the 10%, if you're paying 5% tax, and at the 12%, you're paying a 9% tax, that's an 80% tax increase. So while the tax brackets only went from 10% to 12%, the tax brackets only went up 20%. The effective tax you paid was increased by 80%. And what's mind-blowing is that 70% of Americans, 70% of you watching at home, fall in the first two tax brackets. So think about what I just said. While the taxes only increased by 20%, the effective tax that you paid for somebody who's in the 12% tax bracket is 80% higher than the individual who fell in the 10% tax bracket. Let's move on up to the 22% tax bracket. When you go from 12 to 22, the tax bracket increases by 83%. But when you do the math, the effective tax that you pay only increases by 67%. Moving down the list, it goes from 67% tax increase up to 22. When you jump to the 24, it's only a 27% tax increase, and then a 13% tax increase, and then a 21% tax increase. So the largest effective tax increase is not on the higher tax bracket. It's actually on the lowest tax brackets out there, from the 10 to the 12% tax bracket. That blew my mind when I did that math. I had no idea that that was the way we figured out our taxes. I mean, I knew the brackets, but I had never sat down and done the math. And I did it for this video, and my mind was blown that your taxes go up 80% when you jump from the 10% tax bracket to the 12% tax bracket. Now, between our tax brackets, from the 10 to the 12 to the 22% tax bracket, that encompasses 99% of all tax-paying Americans. So when you go above the 22 to the 24 to the 32, the 35, and the 37, those last four tax brackets only make up 1% of Americans. So what we're seeing is the majority of tax being paid by Americans is being paid at a significantly higher tax bracket. Even though on paper it only looks like a 20% increase, in effect it's an 80% increase. You're paying 80% more taxes than the individual who's in the 10% tax bracket. So hopefully this video helped you understand a little bit more of how much tax you're actually paying. On the positive side, we as Americans pay some of the lowest effective tax rates of anybody in the world. So that's a great thing to think about. But remember, our debt is approaching 27 trillion. They're predicting that we could be at 44 trillion in a number of years. So as much as these tax rates are great for us now, be prepared for them to possibly increase in the future and get worse. So be thinking about this when you're planning for retirement. Think, should I pay my taxes now or should I pay my taxes later? Should I invest in the IRA or should I invest in the Roth IRA? Because it's one thing to be thinking and paying taxes while you're working and you have a little bit of extra income. When you're retired, your income is fixed. You can't just go out and work a little bit more because you're not working. So maybe it's best that you pay your taxes now and not worry about paying taxes later. The beauty of the Roth. I know I talk about the Roth a lot, but it comes back to taxes are a mess, and not having to pay them would be much better. So we have a progressive tax rate in this country, and on one hand, it looks like the lower tax brackets pay less, but what it turns out is you're actually paying significantly more. As always, if you like this video, make sure you hit like. If you enjoy content like this, make sure you hit subscribe, and I'll see you next time.